Welcome back, everybody. We are now getting into our final chapter of the semester, and I always like to end after our entire semester talking about biology and the evolution of life and the diversity of life on Earth, about conservation and some of the risks and threats to diversity that we have today, including climate change. Um, it's a big topic, but we're going to just kind of touch on it very briefly, but I think it's an important way to end this semester. So let's get into this. In your book, this would be chapter 21. We've obviously skipped a lot to get here, and it's a very abridged. But we're going to be talking about conservation, extinction, biodiversity. So these are all of the topics we're going to cover very briefly. What is biodiversity? Why is it important? A little more in depth into extinction, and then some of the biggest threats to biodiversity. Obviously, these are not the only ones. And then very briefly, some strategies to combat all of these threats. So biodiversity has a few different definitions or meanings. So it can be just the number of species and how big those populations are. So if we talk about like the biodiversity of the rainforest, it's like all the different types of plants and animals that live in that ecosystem. But it also means genetic diversity, right? So within a population, how genetically diverse is it? Is there a lot of genetic diversity? Or is everyone a clone, right? Is it a very small population with very reduced diversity? And then a third definition is the ecosystem diversity. So an entire ecosystem could go extinct. And if we're looking at a global scale, right, we have tundras and we have temperate forests, rainforests and pine forests and grasslands and deserts, right? These are all different ecosystems. So on a global scale, ecosystem diversity is a good measure. So we're kind of going from big with ecosystem to very small with the genes. Now, biodiversity is important for many reasons, and I apologize that when it converts to PowerPoint to collaborate, some of the slides get a little messy looking. But there's the reasons that biodiversity is important varies for different people and for depending on what your purpose is. So there's just an intrinsic value. Some people may say, well, it's important to have all of this diversity because it exists, right? If there are 50 species of cat, we should try to just save every species because it exists. Um, but there are other reasons why biodiversity is important. First of all, it gives us a lot of things. We get our food from nature. We get many drugs from nature, right? Antibiotics come from nature, but here at the bottom, I have other pharmaceutical things that treat diseases, and periwinkle treats lymphoma and leukemia. We have things that treat other cancers or heart disease. So we get many of our drugs from natural compounds. Also, minerals are important for our health. There's cultural things that we get from nature, both recreational and beauty, right? I think this past 2 years, a lot of people have gone out into nature to find calm and peace. And that's really important to have that available. In addition, nature, biodiversity provides a lot of things for us, services, not just things we can eat, but things that it does. So climate regulation, absorbing carbon dioxide, um, holding in water, trees do that into the ground, right? Pest control, right? If we allow native predators to flourish and we allow insects to be in our ecosystem, they will eat pests. Pollination, we depend on insects for pollination and we depend on animals for decomposition. So all of these things are necessary to kind of keep Earth running, right? All of these cycles are important. And then also habitat services is the bottom here, which you can't read very well. So soil forms with microbes and worms and things like that, digesting it and working through it and decomposing things. Photosynthesis is a service that is provided. So all of these things are reasons that biodiversity is important. And what happens when we mess with these systems? Well, just one small example, there's an area of China that's lost its pollinators due to overuse of pesticides. And so people have to hand pollinate the trees. And as you can imagine, this is a very slow, laborious process. It only works if you're not paying people or if you're paying them very little. It's much more efficient to have a million bees flying around than to have people climbing trees to do this. So, then when we think about biodiversity, there are different ways to think about it and where it's distributed. And there are some certain hot spots on the globe because biodiversity is not evenly distributed across the world. So a lot of biodiversity, a lot of different animal species is concentrated in a small part of the globe. So these are called hotspots. They have a lot of endemic, which means species that exist there and nowhere else. And these are really big reservoirs of biodiversity. So if we look at these hot spots across the globe, those are the areas that are kind of in like oranges and browns. And a lot of these are rainforests, right? Central America, South America, some parts of Africa, India, right? These are places that have rainforests, a lot of different plants and animals live here. But so this is one way to focus conservation is to really focus on these hot spots. And if you preserve land there in the Amazon rainforest, you're preserving a lot of species. However, we're leaving out major ecosystems with this, right? We're not saving anything in the Arctic if we focus on biodiversity hotspots. Some of these, like the Arctic regions, tend not to have as many organisms, but they have unique organisms. So this is one approach, but it is not the only approach to conservation. So let's talk briefly about extinction. And this, this isn't even updated data, but in the, 35 years from 1975 to the '08, the world's biodiversity declined by 1/3. A lot of habitat loss and trade in wildlife. And this is leading to mass extinctions. So if we look at extinctions in the past, they're marked here by these purple dots. So we can see in the fossil record where there was lots of diversity of organisms and then suddenly, the next layer of fossils, not that much, right? So we can see when there were mass extinctions in the past. The end Cretaceous is the one that people are most familiar with, 65 million years ago. There was one about 250 million years ago that was even bigger. This is called the Great Dying. And we are right now in a sixth mass extinction, right? So here we've got another mass extinction. When I say mass extinction, this means that one species every million years is expected to go extinct, or if you had a million species on Earth, one would go extinct every year. So there's always some species that are going extinct, either just due to random chance, right? They get wiped out, or competition, or something like that. However, the current rate of extinction is up to 1,000 times that background rate. And it may rise even higher. It's kind of accelerating as the millennium continues. So this is what classifies as a mass extinction. And the factors that are contributing to this are habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, and climate change. So habitat destruction, I think everybody understands. Here you can see in purple historic ranges of these major animals. These are big vertebrates that we're looking at. And in pink are the current distributions of them. And you can see not only are the populations much smaller, but they're kind of chopped up so they don't have gene flow between them. So we're going to lose genetic diversity as well, right? If these populations aren't able to mix with one another. Um, Migratory animals are some of the most affected by habitat destruction. And sometimes that's counterintuitive because people may think, well, if they can migrate, they could just go to where it's good, right? But they have instinct to migrate and they need different habitats at different times of the year. And so migratory birds not only need their northern, summer habitat, and their southern winter habitat, but they need stopover places in between. So they need a very large range of habitat. Um, and as habitat is destroyed, they are losing both their northern and southern, but also their stopovers. And if they can't get enough food to continue their long flights, they can't successfully migrate. So I try to intersperse in here some things that we can do to help. As I'm talking about all this doom and gloom, like what can we do to help migratory birds and to help habitat? Well, something we can do is to support shade coffee plantations. There's coffee grown all through Central America, and these plantations have support high numbers of migratory birds. So I've got a picture, and these are the symbols, and you can look for things. Sometimes it just says shade grown, but it'll say bird friendly or Rainforest Alliance coffee. That's different from organic. It's different from fair trade. It's harder to find, but Trader Joe's does have one shade grown coffee. That's not super expensive. All Caribou brand coffee is shade grown. So if you're on the lookout for it, you can find it. And the National Zoo website has lots of information, and they have their own coffee as well. But if we look here, this is a sun coffee plantation on the top. They have clear cut a forest and just plant coffee, whereas a shade grown plantation has the forest cover on top. So you have lots of birds, you have other insects living there, which also means that the birds and some of those insects will keep pest insects away, and so fewer pesticides are needed. The larger trees are also retaining more moisture in the soil, so the farmer doesn't need to water as much. So it tends to be a much more sustainable way of farming. And in addition to providing habitat for other organisms, they could sometimes mix some other crops in there. So this would be a commercial polyculture or traditional polyculture. So they could be growing other crop plants along with the coffee. Another major threat to wildlife are invasive species. So these are species that we introduce either purposely or by accident that end up wreaking havoc in a natural environment. So these are often these species, because they didn't evolve where we've put them, they don't have natural predators or competitors, and they can crowd out native populations. So there is this red list of the worst introduced species through the International Union of Conservation Scientists, the IUCN, and you can look up this list of 100. So some snake species have been introduced, like this is the brown tree snake in Guam, which is an island. So there are no native snakes there, and so the animals have evolved not to be wary of snakes. These snakes have decimated bird populations. They eat the eggs, they eat the chicks, and once snakes are loose, they're very hard to capture, right? They can fit in very small spaces, and it's very hard to eradicate a snake. Closer to home, you may have seen things about the snakehead fish. This is a fish that can walk and breathe air, walk on land. So just what we were talking about when we were talking about vertebrate diversity. They were introduced probably from an Asian fish market. They're native to Asia and were dumped in a pond in Crofton, Maryland, about 10 or 15 years ago. And once they filled up that pond and didn't have enough space, they just up and left and walked somewhere else. They've now made it to the Potomac. So once they're in a river system, right, they can kind of move anywhere. They breed rapidly. They're voracious eaters, so they're eating a lot of the native fish. They're crowding out breeding grounds for native fish, and so there's often, like, sometimes competitions for catching them, catching the biggest one, and restaurants may try to use them to kind of encourage fishermen to capture them and use them as food rather than some of our native fish. It's a classic example of a purposely introduced invasive species, the cane toad. This was introduced to Australia to contain a beetle that had kind of taken over their sugar plants. Unfortunately, the toad is on the ground, and the beetle would climb up tall into the sugar cane. So the didn't work. But these toads have completely taken over. They reproduce very rapidly. They're also voracious eaters. They eat even mammals, and are a huge, huge problem. And then very close to home, hopefully none of you fall in this category, but the domestic cat is one of the most dangerous introduced species on the planet. So they have contributed to about 14% of documented extinctions of birds, mammals, and reptiles. If you have a cat, please, please, please keep it inside. Any outdoor cats that hunt, you may think, oh, it just gets a few birds or rats or something like that, or mice. But you add up all of the outdoor cats, and that's a huge number, 1.4 to 3.7 billion birds a year, and 6.9 to 20.7 billion small mammals. And I've heard people say, well, but we don't want mice around our house. Well, if the cat didn't get it, an owl could, or a hawk, right? So it's taking food away from other native species, and it is decimating populations. So bird populations are really plummeting because of domestic cats. They do not have any defenses against them because they did not co-evolve. Cats are not native to our area. So please, if you have a cat, even if it loves being outdoors, keep it inside, take it on a walk. I've seen people walking their cats on leashes. That is a great way for cats to get fresh air, get some of their energy out, but then keep them in when they're not being watched. So this is something that everybody can do if you're a cat owner. Keeping it inside is something that you can really help. Also, don't purchase invasive species of plants. They can crowd out others. Don't, so just try to be aware of what you are putting into the environment. A third category of a factor of something that threatens species is pollution. Everybody knows what that is. But we'll talk in particular about pesticides. We have talked about how GMOs may decrease the use of pesticides, which is great. One of the dangers of pesticides is that it can result in biomagnification. And that's what this chart is showing. DDT is a pesticide that controls mosquitoes. It's been mainly banned, but can be used worldwide, but can be used with special exceptions. So when Zika virus was a big concern a few years ago, there was permission in some areas to use DDT to try to kill them. But the problem is it would be sprayed widely to kill mosquitoes, and parts would get in the water. So here we see 0.000003 parts per million of DDT in the water. But small organisms eat it, and it kind of concentrates in them. So the 0.04 parts per million in zooplankton, which are microscopic little water organisms. Small fish eat the zooplankton, and it concentrates further in them because they eat a lot of zooplankton, and to 0.5 parts per million. Well, then bigger fish will eat them, and then the large, kind of the top predators, will eat a lot of all of those organisms, and it gets very concentrated in these larger predators, whether it's a bird of prey or large fish. This same thing happens with like mercury in the water. So any metal poisoning in the water gets concentrated. That's why you may hear you shouldn't eat too much, like tuna. Pregnant women aren't supposed to eat certain fishes. It's because they have these large concentrations of dangerous metals or chemicals in them due to biomagnification. So the top of the food chain ends up with a very strong concentration, a high concentration. And finally, our last topic is climate change. And this does not mean that these are the only things that threaten species. Obviously, poaching is a major issue as well. Animal trade, over exploiting organisms for food. So overfishing, things like that. But these are just the ones we're focusing on. We're going to take a break here and then move on to climate change in our last lecture.